There's a man you've probably never heard of. His name was Johann Reichhart, and he killed more people than most serial killers could ever dream of. But here's the twist. He wasn't breaking any laws. He was following them. Between 1924 and 1946, this one man executed over 3,000 human beings. And during the darkest years of Nazi Germany, from 1939 to 1945, he killed 2,176 people. That's not a typo. Nearly 3,000 lives ended at his hands in just 6 years. But Reichhart wasn't a sadistic monster who enjoyed killing. He wasn't even a member of the Nazi Party. He was a state-appointed executioner who came from a family that had been doing this job for 8 generations. And the strangest part? After the war ended, he was hired again, this time to execute the very Nazis he had once worked alongside. This is the story of the man they called Germany's executioner, a man who perfected the art of death, who guillotined university students for handing out anti-war pamphlets, and who eventually paid a terrible psychological price for what he had done. Welcome to Wildorian. Johann Reichhart was born on April 29, 1893, in Bavaria, Germany. Most people inherit their father's business. Maybe you grow up in a family of bakers or carpenters. Reichhart's family? They killed people for the state. He was the 8th generation of executioners in his family. Think about that for a moment. For over 200 years, his ancestors had been the ones standing behind condemned prisoners, pulling levers, tightening nooses, and later, operating guillotines. Death wasn't just the family business. It was in his blood. But Reichhart didn't start his career with an executioner's blade. First, he served his country in World War I. After the war ended in 1918, he became a butcher. The irony isn't lost on anyone. From butchering animals to butchering men, the transition was almost seamless. In 1924, he officially became Bavaria's state executioner. He was 31 years old. Germany was in the Weimar Republic era, a brief period of democracy between 2 world wars. Executions still happened, but they were relatively rare, mostly murderers and violent criminals. The job was steady, but unremarkable. Then 1933 arrived, and everything changed. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The Nazi Party took control, and suddenly the definition of who deserved to die expanded dramatically. Political opponents, resistance fighters, people who spoke out against the regime, those who helped Jews, anyone the state deemed an enemy, could now face the death penalty. Reichhart's quiet job was about to become very busy. Here's something that might surprise you. When you think of Nazi executions, you probably think of concentration camps, gas chambers, firing squads. But one of their favorite methods was far older and, in some ways, more theatrical: the guillotine. The guillotine had been invented in France during the French Revolution as a humane form of execution. One quick blade drop, instant death. The Nazis loved it. They called it the Fallbeil, the falling axe, and they used it extensively. But Reichhart wasn't satisfied with the standard model. He was an innovator, which is a disturbing thing to say about someone whose job was killing people. He studied the mechanics of execution and found ways to make it faster and more efficient. The traditional guillotine used a tilting board called a bascule. The prisoner would be strapped to this board, which would then tip forward, sliding them into position under the blade. This took time, and time meant the prisoner had longer to be terrified. Around 1939, Reichhart made a change. He replaced the tipping board with a fixed bench. The prisoner would simply be placed on it, face down. Then came his second innovation. Instead of using ropes to secure the prisoner's head in place, he designed a metal clamp. The metal clamp was faster and more secure. With these modifications, Reichhart could execute someone in 4 seconds. 4 seconds from the moment they were placed on the bench to the moment they were dead. 4 seconds. That's barely enough time to take 2 breaths. He genuinely believed he was being merciful. In his mind, a faster execution meant less suffering for the condemned. Less time to be afraid, less time to struggle or panic, just a quick, clean death. The Nazi courts saw it differently. To them, Reichhart's efficiency meant they could process more people. More trials, more death sentences, more executions. The People's Court, known as the Volksgerichtshof, became infamous for its show trials and harsh sentences. If you were brought before them, your odds of walking out alive were slim, and waiting at Stadelheim prison in Munich was Johann Reichhart and his guillotine. On February 18, 1943, 2 university students walked into the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich carrying a suitcase. Inside were pamphlets, simple pieces of paper with words printed on them. Their names were Sophie Scholl, 21 years old, and her brother Hans Scholl, 24. They were members of a resistance group called the White Rose. Their crime? They wrote and distributed pamphlets urging Germans to resist the Nazi regime, to stop supporting the war, to recognize the evil being done in their name. That morning, Sophie and Hans scattered the pamphlets around the university. They left them in hallways, slipped them under doors, tossed them from balconies. They were almost done when a janitor spotted them. His name was Jakob Schmid, and he was loyal to the Nazis. He called the Gestapo. Within hours, Sophie and Hans were arrested. The Gestapo interrogated them for 3 days. They tried to protect their friends, taking all the blame themselves. Sophie's leg was broken during the interrogation. When she was finally brought to trial, she had to use crutches. The trial was held on February 22, 1943. It lasted just a few hours. The judge was Roland Freisler, a man so fanatical and brutal that even some Nazis found him excessive. He screamed at the defendants, called them traitors, didn't let them speak in their defense. The verdict was never in doubt: death. But here's the truly shocking part. The execution happened that same day. Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl, and their friend Christoph Probst were sentenced to death in the afternoon. They were executed that same afternoon. Most death sentences involve appeals, delays, paperwork. Not this time. The Nazis wanted them dead immediately, before news of their arrest could spread, before they could become martyrs. At 5 p.m., Sophie Scholl was led into the execution chamber at Stadelheim prison. She was 21 years old, a university student whose only crime was speaking against tyranny. Her leg still broken, she hobbled on crutches. According to witnesses, her last words were, "What does my death matter if by our acts thousands are warned and alerted?" Then Johann Reichhart did his job. 4 seconds later, she was dead. At 5:02 p.m., Hans Scholl was executed. At 5:05 p.m., Christoph Probst followed his friends. 3 young people dead in 5 minutes, all because of words on paper. The Nazi newspapers barely mentioned it, but abroad, especially in Allied countries, the story spread. The New York Times wrote about the student opposition in Munich. These 3 became symbols of resistance, proof that not all Germans supported Hitler. And Reichhart? He went home that evening, probably had dinner, and prepared for the next day's work, because there were always more people to execute. Let's talk about numbers, because the scale of what Reichhart did is almost impossible to comprehend. Over his entire career, from 1924 to 1946, Johann Reichhart executed 3,165 people, but the vast majority happened during the Nazi years. From 1939 to 1945, he personally killed 2,876 people. That's roughly 480 people per year during the war, about 40 people per month, nearly 10 people per week. Think about that. Every single week for 6 years, Reichhart executed about 10 human beings. Some weeks it was more, some less. But the machine never stopped. Who were these people? Some were genuine criminals. Murderers, rapists, violent offenders, but many, probably most, were political prisoners. People like Sophie Scholl, who spoke out against the war, resistance fighters who sabotaged Nazi operations, people who helped Jews hide, people who listened to foreign radio broadcasts, people who told jokes about Hitler. The Nazi state had criminalized dissent, and the punishment was often death. Reichhart was paid 3,000 Reichsmarks per year as his base salary. That's a decent middle-class income for the time, but he also received a bonus for each execution, 65 Reichsmarks per person. Let's do the math. If he executed 2,176 people during the war years, that's 186,140 Reichsmarks in bonuses alone. Add his annual salary, and Reichhart made substantial money from death. But here's the strange thing. He never joined the Nazi Party. Unlike many Germans who eagerly embraced Hitler's ideology, Reichhart maintained he was just doing his job. He was a state functionary, following orders, carrying out court sentences. He didn't write the laws. He didn't conduct the trials. He just finished the process. After the war, this would become his defense. I was just following orders. I didn't kill anyone who wasn't already sentenced to death by a court. I was doing my duty to the state. Sound familiar? It's the same defense used by countless Nazis at the Nuremberg trials and beyond. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. World War II in Europe was over. The Nazi regime collapsed. Suddenly, the men who had sent thousands to their deaths were now prisoners themselves. And Allied authorities had a problem. They had captured hundreds of Nazi war criminals. Major figures like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Julius Streicher would face trial at Nuremberg. They would be sentenced, and many would be sentenced to death. But who would execute them? The answer should surprise no one at this point. They hired Johann Reichhart. The same man who had executed resistance fighters and anti-Nazi protesters was now tasked with hanging Nazi war criminals. The irony was almost poetic. But there was a problem. Reichhart was an expert with the guillotine, not the gallows. Hanging requires skill. If done wrong, the prisoner could strangle slowly for minutes, suffering horribly. The Allies wanted it done cleanly. So for the major Nuremberg executions of the top Nazi leaders in October 1946, they brought in an American executioner, Master Sergeant John C. Woods. But Reichhart was used for other executions, smaller fish, war criminals who didn't make international headlines. Between 1945 and 1946, Reichhart executed 156 people for the Allied occupation authorities. This time he used hanging instead of the guillotine. Some of those he hanged were SS officers, Gestapo agents, concentration camp guards, people who had sent others to die, now facing death themselves. Did Reichhart feel any satisfaction in this? Did he see it as justice, or just another job? We don't know. He never spoke much about his feelings. But in 1946 his career ended. The Allied authorities arrested him and put him on trial. The charge: excessive collaboration with the Nazi regime. Reichhart's defense was what you'd expect. He had never been a Nazi Party member. He had just been doing his job as a state executioner, a position he'd held since 1924, long before Hitler came to power. He hadn't decided who lived or died. He'd only carried out court sentences. The court wasn't entirely convinced, but also wasn't convinced he was a major war criminal. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served 2 years. Then he was quietly released in 1948. After his release, Johann Reichhart tried to live a quiet life. He was now 55 years old, a man who had spent over 2 decades killing people for the state. But the past wouldn't leave him alone. Reichhart began suffering from severe psychological problems. He was hospitalized multiple times for depression and other mental health issues. The details are sparse, but witnesses said he seemed haunted, unable to escape what he had done. Did he see their faces? Did he remember Sophie Scholl hobbling on crutches to the guillotine? Did he think about the thousands of others, the sheer number of lives he had ended? He maintained his guillotine was the most humane method of execution: fast, clean, painless. He seemed to take some comfort in that belief. He had been merciful, in his own way. 4 seconds, and it was over. But perhaps 4 seconds was enough time for each person to feel terror. And perhaps 3,165 moments of 4-second terror adds up to something that crushes a man's soul. Reichhart spent his final years in a nursing home in Dorfen, near Erding in Bavaria. He was alone. His assistants, the men who had helped him carry out executions, were all dead. He was the last one left. On April 26, 1972, 3 days before his 79th birthday, Johann Reichhart died. His body was cremated on May 2nd at a cemetery in Munich, not far from Stadelheim prison where he had spent so many years working, the place where Sophie Scholl and countless others had met their end. There was no public mourning, no memorial services. Germany wanted to forget its executioners, just as it wanted to forget so much about the Nazi era. So what do we make of Johann Reichhart? He was a mass killer who never broke the law, a man who ended more lives than almost any murderer in history, yet was paid by the government to do it. He worked for one of the most evil regimes in human history, yet claimed he wasn't part of it. Is he a villain? Is he a victim? Or is he something more complicated? The easy answer is to call him a monster. Any man who could execute 3,000 people must be devoid of normal human empathy. But the historical evidence suggests Reichhart wasn't cruel or sadistic. He didn't enjoy killing. He actually worked to make executions faster and less painful. The other easy answer is to see him as just a cog in the machine, a man following orders, doing his job. But this is the defense that allowed countless Nazis to escape responsibility. I was just following orders doesn't absolve you when the orders are evil. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and it's deeply uncomfortable. Reichhart represents something frightening about human nature, our ability to compartmentalize. He could execute 10 people in a week and then go home to dinner. He could guillotine a 21-year-old university student and then sleep soundly that night. Or maybe he couldn't, and that's why he ended up hospitalized for psychological problems. He also represents how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. Reichhart wasn't a Nazi ideologue. He wasn't motivated by hatred of Jews or love of Hitler. He was motivated by having a job, earning a living, doing what the state told him to do. And that might be the scariest thing of all, because it means that in the right circumstances, with the right pressures, ordinary people can become instruments of terror. The guillotine that Reichhart used at Stadelheim prison was discovered in 2014, hidden in a basement. It had been lost for decades, forgotten like so much of this dark history. When historians found it, they described it as a machine of death, cold metal that had ended hundreds of lives. But the real machine wasn't the guillotine. It was the system that fed people into it, the courts that held show trials, the laws that made dissent a capital crime, the bureaucrats who processed the paperwork, and yes, the executioner who pulled the lever. Johann Reichhart was one part of a much larger machine of death. Without him, someone else would have done the job. The Nazis would have found another executioner. The White Rose members still would have died. The 3,000 others still would have been killed. But with him, it happened faster, more efficiently, in just 4 seconds. Today, Sophie Scholl is remembered as a hero. Streets, schools, and public squares across Germany bear her name. She is a symbol of resistance, of moral courage, of standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything. And Johann Reichhart? He's mostly forgotten. A footnote in history books. A man who killed thousands but whose name few recognize. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps that's exactly what he deserves. To be forgotten, while his victims are remembered. But we can't entirely forget him, because his story asks us uncomfortable questions. What would we do in his position? How do we resist when the system demands obedience? At what point does just following orders become participation in evil? These aren't just historical questions. They're questions every generation has to answer. Johann Reichhart guillotined 3,000 people. But the really terrifying thing? He was just one man. There were others like him across Germany. There were guards at concentration camps, soldiers carrying out mass shootings, bureaucrats organizing deportations, thousands of ordinary people, each just doing their job, each just following orders. And together, they created the Holocaust. They created World War II. They created some of the darkest chapters in human history. That's the real lesson of Johann Reichhart's story. Evil doesn't require monsters. It just requires ordinary people willing to do monstrous things when the state tells them it's legal, it's necessary, it's just their job. 4 seconds. That's all it took to end a life. But the consequences of those 4 seconds? They echo through history, even now, decades later. Thanks for watching, Wildorian. If this video made you think, if it challenged you, if it disturbed you, then it did its job. History isn't just about learning what happened, it's about understanding why it happened and making sure we never let it happen again. Hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video where we explore more of history's darkest and most fascinating stories.